I'm Adam Grant. I'm an organizational psychologist at Wharton, the author of Give and Take and Originals, and the host of the TED podcast, Work Life. I spend a lot of my time trying to figure out how organizations can fight groupthink, which means making better decisions by hearing perspectives you don't normally see. It also means getting access to new and creative ideas that otherwise weren't on the table. And I see a lot of leaders do this wrong. I work with a lot of leaders who believe that they're fighting groupthink when they're actually causing it. And so I want to talk about what we can do about that. One of the things I hear over and over from leaders across every industry is, don't bring me blank, bring me blank. Think about a boss you had at some point in your career who liked to say that. Don't bring me blank, bring me blank. I'm guessing the sentence is, don't bring me problems, bring me solutions. I get why leaders say this. You want people to be constructive, not whining and complaining. But I actually think this is a dangerous philosophy, because if people can only speak up when they have a solution, you are never going to hear about the biggest problems, which are just too hard for any one person to solve. It also creates a culture that's all advocacy, no inquiry, right? Where if my job is to come up with a solution, then I'm going to find the perfect one and then try to shove it down everybody else's throats, as opposed to saying, hey, here's an issue I've noticed. I'd love to figure out what we can do about this together. So if you want to make good decisions and promote creativity, I actually think it's critical to create a culture where people can speak up about a problem, even if they have no idea how to solve it. And one of the best examples I've seen of that actually is at the hedge fund Bridgewater. So they've been the most successful hedge fund in the history of the industry. They warned their clients in 2007 about an impending financial crisis. It would have been really nice if other financial institutions had done that. And they believe that you can only beat the market by thinking differently. And you can only think differently by avoiding groupthink, which means hearing about all the problems that other people might see. And so one of their principles is that no one has the right to hold a critical opinion without speaking up about it. Think about how different that is from most people's work lives, right? Where if you have a critical opinion, you have no right to speak up about it. So one of the ways they make that real is in performance reviews. They will actually evaluate you on whether you're challenging people above you. So you could be fired for not criticizing your boss's boss, which is pretty amazing. So the culture got tested a few years ago. There was a big client meeting, and Bridgewater's founder, Ray Dalio, got an email from this guy, Jim, 3 levels below. And it said, "Dear Ray, I give your performance today a D-. You rambled incoherently for about an hour. It was totally obvious that you weren't prepared. This was really bad. It can't happen again." Now, I don't know about you, but personally, I tend not to send those kinds of emails to the billionaire founders of my company. And what's so interesting is the way that Ray responded. He wrote back and he said, "Dear Jim, I'm sorry I let you down." And then he copied everybody else in that meeting and asked them to rate his performance on a scale from A to F. And let me tell you, he did not get any A's. And if you think about the effect of that kind of behavior, one, he signals to every junior person in the organization, you can criticize anybody, even the founder himself. So everyone has a voice. And two, every leader and manager in that organization gets a clear message, right? I need to be as open, as willing to learn from my mistakes as our founder is on his best day. And that's the kind of behavior that really makes it easy for people to speak up about problems. So Jim had pointed out this problem, and it turns out there's a recording of the meeting, which means Ray can review it. And after he watches it, he says to Jim, "You were right. I sucked. I'm going to ramble less. I'm going to prepare more." And Jim said, "I'm sorry, Ray. I can't trust you to do that. If you were going to improve in those areas, you already would have a long time ago." And so Ray actually asked Jim to hold him accountable and to give him feedback after meetings on whether he rambled, whether he seemed unprepared, to make sure that he follows through. And I think that's a really effective way to deal with problems, right? To say, look, as a leader, I'm willing to hear all the criticism that people give me from below. And then I want to not only take action on it, I want to get other people to give me feedback on whether I'm taking action on it. But I also think we need structural mechanisms to make it easier for people to surface problems. And one of the best ones I've seen in action is at Warby Parker, the unicorn startup that sells eyewear. So a few years ago, they took their suggestion box and they actually turned it into a problem box. It's a Google Doc where anytime you see something wrong, let's say it's a technical bug, for example, you can just submit it into the Google Doc and the whole company has access to it. So other people can see the problem that you identified. And what's powerful about it is they have managers in the organization review that Google Doc every couple weeks and vote on which problems are strategically important to the company. And that way you get a signal about which problems matter and which ones don't. You can also find out whether other people are seeing the same problems that you are. And then if you want to make it part of your job to work on one of the important problems, you can do that and even build a team around you. And so I think every organization should have a problem box, not just a suggestion box. One of the other ways that I see a lot of leaders try to surface problems is they're afraid of groupthink. And they say, I know we need a devil's advocate. So if there's a majority opinion in the room, I'm going to assign somebody to represent a different view. And this is a brilliant idea with one tiny wrinkle. It doesn't work. Research led by Charlon Nemeth at Berkeley has shown that assigned devil's advocates rarely convince anyone of anything, and they often leave people more convinced of the majority opinion they already held. Two big problems come into play when you assign a devil's advocate. One is that everybody knows they're just playing a role, and so they don't take that person seriously enough. The other issue is that that person knows I'm just playing a role too, and so doesn't end up arguing forcefully enough. The way you overcome those barriers is instead of assigning a devil's advocate, you want to unearth the devil's advocate. So that means finding somebody who genuinely disagrees with the prevailing view in the room and inviting that person into the conversation to dissent. And that increases the probability that the group will make a good decision or come up with a creative solution to a problem. And we have a lot of evidence on that from controlled experiments, but when I talk with leaders about it, one of the areas of pushback I hear is, okay, look, I get that a genuine dissenter is more persuasive than, somebody who's just role-playing the devil's advocate. But what if I invite that genuine dissenter to speak up and they're wrong? And my response is good, because, I enjoy seeing organizations fail. It gives me more research to do. No, of course not. I say good because the evidence shows that minority opinions, dissenting views, improve decision-making and creativity even when they are incorrect. So the function of real dissent is that it forces divergent thinking, right? It encourages us to take a step back, re-examine our criteria for making a decision, consider options that weren't already on the table, and that's good for decision process, even if it temporarily steers us in the wrong direction. One of the simplest mistakes that leaders make when they're trying to drive a group decision is they just don't consider enough options. So there's research led by Paul Nutt, which showed that about half of decisions made in organizations fail. They fall way short of their goals. And the most common warning sign of a failed decision is having only considered two options. Even just putting a third on the table with that dissenting view is enough to help people see problems in the existing two and maybe overcome roadblocks that they hadn't anticipated already. So one of the most critical decisions that you have to make is who to let in the door in the first place when you're hiring or recruiting volunteers or building a team. And when you look at how leaders make these kinds of choices, you tend to see that they focus on a few different ways of vetting people. One is to say, look, I'm primarily searching for a set of skills. So I've got a job description and I want to compare different candidates to that job description and choose the person who's best able to do the work. But there's a second group of leaders that says, no, skills are important, but what I care more about is star potential. I don't really worry that much about what you're able to do today. I want to know how excellent you'll be tomorrow. So I might be interested in your learning agility or your intelligence. And that seems like a pretty reasonable thing to focus on. There's a third group of leaders, though, that says, skills and stars are nice to have, but at the end of the day, we're doomed if we don't have culture fit. We need people who are passionate believers in our mission and who are willing to kind of eat, sleep, and breathe our values. So the question is, of course, you want all three of those, right? You want somebody with great skills today who's going to be a superstar tomorrow who also fits the culture perfectly. But you don't always have that option to combine all of those factors. And so there's a great 15-year study of Silicon Valley startups looking at founders who use different blueprints, the skills, stars versus culture fit blueprints in their hiring and also in the way that they might reward and promote people. And the question is, which of those approaches is most effective? So which approach is most effective? It turns out that the founders who put culture fit first, their startups are significantly less likely to fail and also more likely to eventually go public. they're able to attract and motivate and retain a uniquely talented group of people who could not imagine working or volunteering anywhere else because they believe in the mission. And yet, when you look at what happens to these companies over time after they go public, the ones who put culture fit first have the slowest growth when you look at financial measures like annual market capitalization. So culture fit seems to be beneficial early, and then it hurts you later. What happens is, as your organization grows, you have to adapt, right? You have to change. You have to deal with disruption from the outside. And so you can no longer just say, look, we were founded on a disruptive vision. All we need are people who want to execute that vision. Now you have to be able to adjust. And when you hire on culture fit, when you promote people who match that culture, you're essentially encouraging groupthink because you're weeding out diversity of thought and you're only bringing in and elevating people who tend to approach the world the same way as everyone else. So the logical conclusion is then that you need to say, all right, we're gonna be all about culture fit early on, and then we're gonna shift our culture model. The more effective model later on is to focus on stars. But the data show that if you change your model, even from a bad one to a better one, it hurts your performance. It just creates a huge amount of cultural upheaval. And it's often the people who are most effective who are the first to leave because they have great options elsewhere. The best antidote to this problem I've seen is actually to throw culture fit out the window altogether. There's a great alternative that comes from IDEO, the design innovation firm that created the mouse for Apple. A few years ago, they realized that they were only hiring designers to solve certain kinds of problems. And they were getting asked to do all sorts of unusual projects that weren't up their alley. Like they had to reimagine a shopping cart for a grocery store. And they got to work on redesigning Sesame Street. And the designers didn't always have the answers. So they said, okay, what we need to do is diversify. And they actually went and created a new job title called anthropologist. Because, that's what anthropologists do for a living, right? They go into a foreign culture, they make sense of it, and then they try to translate that understanding back. So they hired their first few anthropologists, and then pretty soon they said, wow, this is incredible. We should only hire anthropologists. And then they realized they were falling into the same trap that they had before. And every time they get excited about a skill set or a background or a worldview, they realize it's time to stretch again. So what they've done is they've really replaced cultural fit with cultural contribution. Diego Rodriguez, who used to work at IDEO, talks about it that way. He says, look, you don't want to bring in people who are going to clone your culture. You want to bring in people who are going to enrich your culture by adding something that was missing. And so I think this is a great model for thinking about how you hire and recruit and promote and reward people. Don't worry about whether they fit. Instead, ask yourself, what is absent from our culture, and how do I find people who are going to enhance it and improve it beyond where it is?